This is a recreation of a talk that I gave in November of 2009 to the College of Liberal Arts Emeritus Association at Cal State Long Beach, in which I discussed the retirement career that I pursued as an amateur historian of Chinese Americans in North America, and which I want to illustrate some of the unexpected and unusual experiences as I have discovered that the older I get, the more Chinese I have become through this line of research and writing and giving presentations. I would start actually by saying a few words about a discovery that I made while I was doing these talks over the last few years. My Chinese name turns out, according to someone who knows the Chinese proverbs, my name was actually part of a famous Chinese proverb, which basically means remember your roots. The proverb actually is when you drink water, remember the source, which turns out to be somewhat ironic in that much of what I've been doing in my work has been to pay homage and tribute to the Guangdong, China roots that my parents and many of the majority of the early Chinese immigrants prior to 1965 came from. When I first started doing this research, I really wasn't sure exactly how well received or how well I could actually pull this off. I started to write about my family's history, where we were the only Chinese in the whole town of Macon, Georgia, from the late 1920s to the early 1950s. So I created a website which turned out to be quite providential in that it paid some very handsome dividends that were totally unexpected. That what happened was, when I posted this website, it was discovered by several people, first of whom was the preeminent scholar and historian of Chinese America, especially with regard to Chinese American women immigrants, Judy Jung. And she had run across my website by accident and had contacted me to ask about places that she could visit in Georgia that were of historic value. I was able to make this contact with her and introduce her to my work on the book that would eventually be Southern Fried Rice, my memoir of our family's experiences. And fortunately, she gave me lots of good advice and suggestions and mentored me in writing this book. In addition, at the other end of the spectrum, I was fortunate that a scholar who was just finishing his PhD, an historian working on the history of Chinese in the state of Georgia in the major cities of Atlanta, Augusta, and Savannah. And he was quite excited to find out my background. And since then, we've collaborated in sharing a lot of information in terms of our common history, interest in Chinese history in the South. Turns out that his mentor, one of his mentors at Georgia State University, was Kristen Moon, a historian who has done excellent work with her book Yellow Face, which is a history of how Chinese are caricatured in portrayals on the stage and entertainment. And she was very interested in my work because she was involved with the National Association of Asian American Studies, which was going to be holding its national conference in Atlanta that year. And this is the first time it had ever been held in the South. And they were interested in finding people who were doing work that would be relevant to showing the presence of Chinese in the Deep South prior to the more recent times. When we decided, no, my parents decided to move the family from Georgia, where we were the only Chinese in our town, to San Francisco so that we would have more contact with Chinese community, the local newspaper wrote a very nice and endearing salute to my father in the local newspaper. However, there were several rather dramatic misconceptions in the write-up. One was about my father coming to America and that his father had come over first, which was not at all true, but was part of what the official immigration record indicated, because my father was a paper son, which meant that many Chinese who were not eligible for immigration would come using false documents. And so he came under the pretense that his real father, which was not his real father, was already here and was bringing him over. Secondly, it indicated that my father had saved up money to go home to China to bring his childhood sweetheart over as his wife, which was a total fiction because Chinese were not engaging in romantic marriages. They were all arranged marriages. And then the third misconception was about my parents being devout followers of Confucius, which was not at all true. They were very agnostic, if anything, and not very devoted followers of any particular form of religion or Buddhism or other philosophies. So how that came about was probably the interviewer asked questions that met his preconceptions, and my father, not being one to want to argue with him, just probably smiled and nodded, and the reporter, the columnist, interpreted those as affirmations. Now, my father opened a laundry in 1928, and here's a photograph of it as it was in 1953. We lived above the laundry, assembly laundry, which was a very common name for Chinese laundries, and encircled the three windows, which were the living space above the laundry, which in the summer in Georgia, where it's very hot and humid, and we had a steam laundry, the laundry heat rose up to our living quarters, which made it virtually unbearable. Now, I happened to have the good fortune to find in an archive this photograph, which at first, which comes from 1906, which shows the very same building that our laundry was in. I've circled the three windows on the far right of the column. At first, I didn't recognize this picture. The archive said that it was on Mulberry Street, which is our street. But the large structure was the Lanier Hotel, and those balconies out in front had been torn down by the time I was born. But once I spotted those three windows, I was positive that that was the very same building that we lived in. I subsequently found that that building had been a Chinese laundry as early as 1885, a fact which was quite interesting to me because when I lived there, I never even wondered at all whether there had ever been a laundry owned by some other Chinese prior to my father moving into that very same building. Well, here's a photograph of the cover of the memoir Southern Fried Rice, which I published to try to give a record of what life was like for my parents coming all the way from China to Georgia, what it was like for us children to grow up in Georgia, in Macon, as the only Chinese, and then toward the end of the book, talk about the major move of our family to California, to San Francisco, and what life was like for us afterwards. Writing a book is hard work, but actually it's probably even harder work to publicize your work and to um, call it to the attention of people and try to get them interested in reading and, of course, buying the book. I gave a talk in San Francisco at the Chinese Historical Society Museum on Clay Street in Chinatown. And because of the publicity that was sent out by the museum, a Chinese talk show host in Oakland contacted me to see if I would be willing to be interviewed. And there's a long story about this interview, but basically I was a little reluctant to do it, but I decided that it might be a worthwhile experience, and certainly, hopefully, it would help, publicize the book. And so here are a couple of scenes from my 8 minutes of fame on this program. In addition to doing research for writing Southern Fried Rice, I acquired some skills and some knowledge about archives and census records, and I was able, fortunately, to help other people with their questions about Chinese American history. So one woman contacted me and asked me how I should answer her third grade child who learned from school about Martin Luther King and segregation in the South. And the mother wanted me to give some idea how to answer the child's question, that if there were still colored and white drinking fountains, which one should this child, who herself was an adopted Chinese girl, where would she be required or allowed to drink? I also received contacts from people of mixed ancestry, Chinese and Black parentage, who were very interested in trying to learn more about their own parental roots in the South. And sometimes I was able to help, and sometimes I wasn't. And I got very interesting responses. Here are 3 different responses. One telling me that even though we were unable to actually find the census records for her father, she could vicariously understand from reading about my family history what things might have been like for her parents. I found also from communicating with other people who learned about my book that in our family, were not the only people who were isolated culturally. In fact, one day I got this interesting email from a Chinese man, actually a few years older than I was, who discovered after someone referred him to my book that his family, who lived in North Carolina, had a very similar experience. That they, in fact, in Kannapolis, North Carolina, their family was the only Chinese family in their town. And so I give you an excerpt here of a part of an email that he sent to his 4 brothers, in which he remarked that they lived above their laundry as well, and that their building even looked very similar to our own. Another example was an African-American woman who came up and told me that she could relate to her experience because her family was the only Black family in the town in Vermont where she grew up. Because of my experience in looking at immigration and census records, I was able to help other people search for, and in a couple of cases, find their records of their parents, for which they were very grateful to me for. And I felt very fortunate that I was able to use my experiences to benefit them.